are going to go into the second part of the topic, which is sociology and common sense. And in the last lecture, one discussed the fact that why do we have common sense? And the argument was basically that as human beings, active, agential human beings, women, men, and other people of other sexualities or genders, have certain ideas about society. It's not an add-on. It's not like we get born and we first learn how to eat and grow physically and then we develop ideas. As we grow, we develop ideas. It's intrinsic. It is an inextricable part of our growing up, part of our physical growing up. All of you would be familiar, if you are students of sociology, that there's often this story about the wolf child. The wolf child who could never become a proper human being once the wolves had taken a human child away and brought them up as their own, and never learned to walk on his feet, never learned to have cooked food, never learned to speak, never had language, and therefore did not have those qualities which we associate with human beings. So when we talk about common sense ideas, please realize that they don't come as an additional, secondary addition to how we live. Even as we cook, even as we hunt, we have ideas about what cooking is, what hunting is. Even as we sing, we have ideas about what the song and music is. Even as we study, we have ideas about what studies are. And these ideas are part and parcel of human life. And these ideas, most importantly, if we have to do a sociology of common sense, are historically specific. As I discussed in the last lecture, so a feudal society would have very different kind of common sense. A capitalist society would have very different common sense. If somebody just left everything and wanted to be a poet and belonged to a very privileged community or family in a feudal society, it would be completely all right, because the wealthy were supposed to do those finer things of life. But in a modern society, for many middle class, even if they are privileged, it would be a little odd when you say, I don't want to work. So these ideas, historicity and social relations or material relations of production are very, very closely interlinked. Durkheim therefore says that, look, human beings did not wait, that look, one day there'll be a Durkheim, or one day there'll be a Marx, and one day there'll be sociology, and only then we will have ideas. Human beings from day one had ideas about the society that they lived in, and these ideas not only are coercive and external and general, but they have an emotional quality. What makes emancipation, why is it so difficult to get rid of common sense? What makes emancipation from such notions peculiarly difficult in sociology is that sentiment so often intervenes. We enthuse over our political and religious beliefs and moral practices very differently from the way we do over the objects of the physical world. We are not going to weep over a particular machine or a particular rocket, but we may get extremely emotional about our religious beliefs, our political beliefs, or our moral practices. There is a very inextricable link between these kind of ideas and our emotional or affective relationship to this. Consequently, this emotional quality is transmitted to the way in which we conceive and explain our beliefs. Therefore, in sociology, there's so much debate about objectivity and subjectivity and getting rid of biases, because all these thinkers realize that this emotional quality is a very central part of the manner in which ideas inhere or ideas are located in society and are born by society. So there is a challenge to scientific examination. For example, and this is again a quote from Durkheim, a proposition may not accord with our view of patriotism or personal dignity. It is therefore denied, whatever may be the proofs advanced. We cannot allow it to be true. It is rejected, and our strong emotions seeking a justification for so doing have no difficulty in suggesting reasons which we find readily conclusive. So Durkheim, as you know, had himself been questioned about his patriotism, he was also questioned about his religious beliefs. So the idea when he said that, look, if a sociologist studies religion, you have to see all religions in the same way, and you have to have certain kinds of theory or concepts by which you identify the manner in which you're going to study religion. And his very famous idea of the distinction between the sacred and the profane, you are very familiar with. Here, a lot of people would then tell him that how can you study all religions in the same way? And if you recall, at that point of time, the evolutionary theory was very much in fashion, and people would say, okay, simple society, tribal societies may be misconceived about the truth of God, but it cannot be true of the Western Christian world. Whereas Durkheim was arguing that as a sociologist, the approach to religion has to be very different. So there is again a contestation or a challenge to the scientific examinations of many of our social institutions, be it religion, family, caste, community, language, ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, because with each of this we have very strong emotional feelings. These notions may even be so prestigious, they will not tolerate scientific examination. The mere fact of subjecting them, as well as the phenomena they express, to cold, dry analysis is repugnant to certain minds. Say culture is a good example, that when you say that we are so used to the culture which is contemporary as being our culture, that very often we would say this is how it always was. This was never different. It was always was. And if somebody, a historian maybe, an anthropologist maybe, counters that, you would say that this, how can we even do this? This is repugnant. Now I come to a second point. So we've discussed, if I sort of very quickly sum up what we were discussing, we began by saying that in order to understand the specificity of sociology, the sociological theory and method, or we have to understand there's a break between common sense and sociology. However, common sense is very much part of the social, and sociologists study common sense. So the break is not absolute, that we have nothing to do with the common sense, but the break is absolute in the sense that we look at common sense or beliefs very differently from the practicing person as a member of society would. Where do common senses reside? What are the kind of sites in where common sense resides? Beliefs and practices, ideas and values, culture and language. Now let us look concretely at proverbs and idioms to examine the common sense. And I take certain common sense and idioms and proverbs, mostly from English, one or two from Hindi, the muhavaras. One is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Is this common sense wrong? Not at all. Any financial advisor will tell you that if you are doing a FD, do 2 or 3 different FDs, or you do one mutual fund, one life insurance and one fixed deposit. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. A young person applying for admission to any university, everybody would say apply in as many places as you can. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Now in that you can see it's practical. There's common sense is always practical, and the point I mentioned before, common sense helps you to navigate or negotiate life in society as a status quo, as given. You don't ask why, but what you do is follow those prescriptions and hope the best will come out of it. Another, if you play with fire, you will get burned. Of course, if you play with fire, you will get burned. But very often, for women of my generation, they would say that why do you want to go and leave your town and go to a distant city and go to the hostel? It's like playing with fire. You will get burned. It is dangerous. Now, if you stuck to it, you probably would not be playing with fire, but you would be also, prohibiting yourself from exploring the world or trying out new career options, which maybe your brother or a cousin, a male cousin, would be able to. So most proverbs are practical, idioms are practical, they help you negotiate, but they also reinforce the status quo. You have the very familiar Hindi muhavara which says jiski lati uski bhais. So the point here is that whoever wields the stick is the person who also will own the buffalo or will own the cow. In other words, it means that those who have power are going to control everything. And here it is true, it is absolutely right. You can follow this by saying avoiding this, but you could also question this. In sociology, you would ask question, what, why, how did this power get consolidated? It takes two to make a quarrel. So very often people will say that, say maybe there is a bad marriage and there, there's been some domestic violence, and even the girl's parents would say that you did not adjust enough. It takes two to make a quarrel. It seems very neutral, but in a society which is hierarchical and not neutral, it often means that you take the side of the dominant. There was never a conflict without a woman. Again, extremely gendered, that the conflict source is always a woman. Look at the other one, again very gendered. A man is as old as he feels, a woman as old as she looks. Joru ka gulam, henpecked, the fact that a man who listens to his wife is an object of ridicule, but a wife who listens to the husband is normal, it's common sense. Time is money. I'd given you the examples of the distinction between a feudal society and a capitalist society. And in a capitalist society, time indeed is money. Time is money. So proverbs very often reflect the ruling ideas of the ruling class in a specific historical society. Suppose you go to a society which is subsistence economy. If you could do a kind of going back in time machine and go to a society where everything is subsistence economy, so you grow the crops you grow, you eat the fruit you grow, you go to sleep when you're tired, you get up, eat a little more. And here, if you go and tell them, look, time is money, it will make no sense, because the material conditions upon which these ideas rest are so different that it will make absolutely no sense over here. So what we assume is common sense in one society, to go back to the point where we began in the first lecture, that it is not common, nor is it always necessarily makes sense across certain kinds of societies. So dominant common sense. So common sense is always dominant. Again, I'll give you certain kinds of examples to make the point. And inequalities provide a very good vantage point. Rich, very often when we were young, we would hear this, rich becomes rich because they work very hard and they save very well. But you know that physically, the poor work much harder. They work much harder, and yet they cannot save very well, because what they earn, they have to spend. It is of so little amount that they probably cannot save, whereas people like us who are more privileged are able to save more because we earn more. And why do we earn more? Not because we necessarily work harder, but because we have certain what we call social capital, physical capital, cultural capital, which allows us that certain leeway to save well. Caste, very often common sense will say, is just a division of labor, functional roles. Assuming that it's something which can change over time, it's not something which is fixed, and it is going to also invisibilize notions of inequalities, exclusion, discrimination. Gender, very often even in conferences I hear this point, look, a woman must adjust for a marriage to function. These are all dominant common sense. Why is it common sense? Because it's sensible, it's practical. By which criteria is it sensible? By which criteria is it practical? If we take the criteria of the status quo, it is practical, it is sensible. But if we try to see it historically across a comparative society, then we will say, but this was not how it always was. And if we take the vantage point of a modern consciousness of democratic rights and social justice, if we take our constitution as the vantage point, then we will say that, look, this is not right. The dominant common sense, to go back to our earlier lecture, is therefore very often the expression of the legitimacy of the ruling powers. that it is the official version. Is common sense therefore common and sensible? And the argument that I'm trying to make is that it's not common, nor is it very sensible always. Does common sense refer to those universal properties of mind, rationality, in a sense that all humans have in common? Very often when we do sociology and we study common sense, we must realize that this is not referring to any universal properties of mind, rationality, in a sense that all humans have in common. It is, in the other sense, it is specific to particular social and historical communities of sense and knowledge. It belongs to a particular group. Very recently, because in the lockdown in COVID, you watch a lot of films online, you watch serials, and I was watching an English series which is the Downton Abbey, and it's talking about the early 20th century Britain, where you had the aristocracy still living in great style. And there is the idea, one of them expresses, if there is no style, there is no life. And the idea of having a particular lifestyle is very sensible. You have a retinue of domestic servants, you have a hierarchy between the servants, and you hold on that as the most virtuous of the world. You feel like this is common sense. It's common sense that you must do anything that is in your hand to retain this. Now we notice, people like us find it very alien, that what's the big deal? Why do they want to hang on to that lifestyle? And you have in this series discussions between the American protagonist and the others saying, but life has to change. This is specific, which again means the feudal ideas, the common sense of that society may not be the common sense of a modern society. It changes. So it is not common necessarily, and it may not appear sensible to us. Say, when I was young, I would hear that in the early 19th century Bengal, you would have the idea that you can't have a woman who will die unmarried. And yet you could not marry outside caste. This is among the privileged communities and castes. And among the Kulin Brahmins, for example, you would have very old men who would go around marrying women just to ensure, because common sense was that you can't have the father die without having got his daughter married, and that too married to a person belonging to the right community. Endogamy is, as we call it in sociology. Likewise, I saw in a very distant land of the Downton Abbey of early 20th century Britain, where it didn't matter what was the age, as long as you married somebody of your status, of your own, you don't use the word caste there, but of your status, of your class there, So you have the common sense often being neither common nor very sensible. I'll sort of shift a little. And one of the things I was trying to do through this presentation is to show to you that, look, why do we do theory? Very often we do theory in sociology, and you do Marx, and you do Weber, and you do Durkheim, and you do Smeltzer, and you do Parsons, and you do Ritzer, and you do whole kinds of theories. And very often we don't ask this question, but why? And I didn't introduce this topic earlier because I wanted to, convey the salience and the pervasive nature of common sense before I wanted to argue that the break between common sense and sociology is that sociology belongs to what we call theoretical knowledge and follows certain protocols of science. Here I go back to one more scholar, Robert Park, who wrote in 1940 this wonderful paper called News as Knowledge. And it's very important in the contemporary context of the great salience of media to look at news as knowledge. And he makes a distinction. He doesn't use the word common sense, but he is referring very similar concepts, knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by knowledge about. What is knowledge by acquaintance? Knowledge by acquaintance is the kind of knowledge we acquire as we grow up. So in our neighborhood, in the family which we grew up, we learn that A neighbor is like that, B neighbor is like that, A neighbor is like that because they come from a particular ethnic group, B neighbor is like that because they come from a very wealthy class background. We get knowledge which comes from first hand personal encounters with the world. We know things to which we are accustomed. This is knowledge which is customed, a world in which we are adjusted. Such knowledge may be conceived like organic knowledge. It's like adaptation, adjustment. A girl shouldn't run. A girl has to be careful about how she speaks. A girl should not be noisy. This knowledge is called knowledge which is just by adaptation or adjustment. Accommodation, it is called tacit knowledge. This accommodation of the individual is the habitat, is tacit. We don't always explain it explicitly. So if the grandmother says, look, you're a girl, you can't just run out into the streets like that. You don't say why. You just say you can't do it because you're a girl. A lot of knowledge is implicit, it's tacit, it's not explicit. One might go so far to describe this knowledge by acquaintance as personality traits. It becomes part of who we are. It is part of our formal sentiments. It's part of who we are. Other forms of acquaintance of knowledge is what we call clinical knowledge. You know that, okay, you burnt, you used the atta which you have kneaded. The wheat which you have needed for making roti, and if you apply it when you have a burn, it usually cools and heals. These are called clinical knowledge, skills and technical knowledge. This is, in a certain sense, we learn through experimentation. And we learn also about other people. Our other knowledge of other persons is almost like intuitive knowledge. We get a sense, oh, that person is angry, they are not happy with me. So that kind of knowledge is intuitive. Our knowledge of other persons and of human nature seems to be of this sort. All this is common sense knowledge. It is about the social, but not the same as sociological knowledge. To sense what others are thinking, human beings are very often very astute, and to figure out, is the other person interested? Say, as a teacher, you get a sense, are people interested in listening to what I am saying, or are they bored? We have a sense, we are tuned to it. How do you do it? Is it magical? It's not magical. It is because we belong to the same world. We have learned what a bored expression looks like. We get a sense of how you may be thinking. We have a certain understanding of who you are. And this knowledge, very interestingly, you have Robert Parks saying, this is like the knowledge of a customer. Like you go to a sari shop and say, for my generation, and they look at you and they say, okay, you're one of those people who would like cotton, and they'll take a particular kind of saris and show it to you. This is the knowledge of a customer, which is a salesman knows of a customer. It is not the knowledge of sociology, very different. It is practical, it works, but it's not the same as sociological knowledge. It is a knowledge which becomes part of our habit, part of our custom. We know immediately what to do, how to do. It's even more the sort of knowledge which gets embodied in habit, custom, and eventually by some process of natural selection, we do not fully understand a kind of instinct. This is also a synthetic knowledge. This is a synthetic knowledge, not analytical. It is embodied. Why? Because it is part and parcel of our habit and custom. If it gets itself communicated, it will be in the form of practical maxim. Remember the proverbs which we talked about when we said don't put all your eggs in a basket? You're not explaining it, you're not communicating it. Just that proverb, in a very prescient fashion, abbreviated fashion, tells you what you ought to do and ought not to do. This is called synthetic knowledge, recipe knowledge, the salesman knowledge of the customer. It is practical sense, hunches. But these practical sense or hunches can lead to science. You say, why does it keep happening? How does the salesman always know what to tell the customer? And you can do a proper sociological study of that, but that will be taking the hunch as the beginning, but then having certain kind of methods, theories and protocols of science which will be transparent, that somebody else can be able to check it. Somebody else can't check the validity of my common sense, but sociologists can check the validity about common sense. So Robert Park's distinction about knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge about. Knowledge by acquaintance is common sense knowledge, and knowledge about is what we call social science knowledge. This is formal, rational, systematic, based on observation and fact, but on fact that has been checked, tagged, regimented, and ranged in this and that perspective. You say, look, I am going to study class in this slum, and I define class in this fashion. And then I have taken this kind of sampling, and I have done this kind of questionnaire, and somebody else can also go and check that. It is exact, it is precise. It may not be never to be invalidated. Science is never supposed to be forever. Science is always context specific. It can be invalidated. What is proven today may be proven wrong tomorrow. Science is open to criticism. Science is open to challenge. Science is open to critique, not based on opinion, but on the protocols of knowledge. I go back just very briefly of how it's a challenge to break from common sense and how ideas enter into the very nature of things. It may also shape the kind of questions which we ask when we do a particular survey. That supposing we ask questions which are about attitudes, we'll get one kind of answers, and if we ask questions about actual how people do, you may get very different kind of answers. So scientific knowledge and sociological knowledge are very different from commonsensical knowledge. When we do social science knowledge, there has to be a certain understanding of philosophy and knowledge, a certain understanding of history, certain understanding of classification. And we have a certain understanding of concepts which we have to identify, how we describe and measure. There has to be an empirical science, a certain logical approach. I am not going to go into detail, but I hope I have been able to communicate the fundamental distinctions between social science and common sense. Very often we assume that social problems are given. So common sense may tell you that a woman who is working is a problem, but social science will approach it by looking at why did this idea come about, which kind of societies believe in it, how is it linked to material forms of production, what is its historicity, very different kinds of questions. We don't run to normative questions, oh this is so bad or this is so good. That is not the kind of approach that a sociological knowledge has. It is something which we have to move towards research, not just find data to say, oh this is right or this is wrong, but systematic research which can be reproduced and transferred. Unlike common sense knowledge, which is often very tacit, sociological or scientific knowledge is communicable. We can explain, as I mentioned, what is the theory we adopted, what is the method we adopted, what was the empirical process that we went about, and somebody can criticize me saying that there is a logical inconsistency. Why is it communicable? Because the problems and its solution are stated not merely in a logical fashion, in an intelligible fashion, but can be checked by experiment. There is a source, there is a method, there is a fact, there is a theory. So when I make my presentation, I am very careful that look, this is from Durkheim, this is from Bourdieu, this is from Marx, this is from Robert Park. The sources are important. If I say a certain kind of data, maybe with COVID-19, I must accredit it, I must test it. Experience versus systematic investigation. Systematic investigation, we saw, became so important during the pandemic. We have to have concrete data for concrete policies to be formed. We have to have an idea, we have to have genome sequencing to find out if the virus is mutating. We have to find out, where is it that it is changing. This kind of issue is very, very important if we have to move towards teeth, and this is why data matters. Data will important only if we approach it from a sociological knowledge, which the data will be important. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity to speak.